PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors of books about Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with William Ecenbarger about his book, Work, Fight, or Play Ball: How Bethlehem Steel Helped Baseball Stars Avoid World War I.
This week on PA Books, William Ecenbarger, author of Work, Fight, or Play Ball.
William Ecenbarger is the author of Work, Fight, or Play Ball: How Bethlehem Steel Helped Baseball Stars Avoid World War I. How did you discover the Bethlehem Steel League?
Well, about 30 years ago, I lived in Cornwall, Lebanon County, and I used to walk my dog over in an abandoned amusement park, and one of the dog's favorite places was this field, and there was a sign on the field that said Babe Ruth Field. So finally my curiosity got the best of me, and I called the Lebanon County Historical Society, and I asked them, why do they call it Babe Ruth Field? He didn't play here, did he? And they said, well, actually, he did play here, and we even have his uniform. So I was hooked.
Do you find that people remember the league? Is it in the communities themselves?
No, there were a few. I did, now this is, when I first got into this some 30 years ago, I did find a couple of people who remembered seeing Babe Ruth play, but at that time there were very few. But I did find a couple of people who remembered him and saw him play and saw him at the steel mill.
How long did this league last?
2 years, 1917, 1918.
And so this was the Bethlehem Steel League. So talk about Bethlehem Steel and how they ended up coming up with teams for the different plants.
Well, there was a guy named Charles Schwab, who is not the Charles Schwab we know at the financier. This was an earlier Charles Schwab, no relation to the financier. And he was quite a powerful figure. He knew William Vanderbilt and Andrew Carnegie. And he founded the Bethlehem Steel Corporation. And as part of his attempt to stimulate employee morale. He was virulently, by the way, anti-union, so he was always trying to find ways to keep his workers happy. So he formed this 6-team baseball league. He had teams in Lebanon, Steelton, Bethlehem, one near Baltimore, and a couple of shipyards that Bethlehem Steel owned, one in Wilmington, Delaware, and one in near Boston. And he set this league up in 1917, and they played. They had a season, and it was manned by people who worked at the plants. But in 1918, there was something came down called, well, the United States got into World War I in 1917, and by 1918 they were seeking to call up the troops. So. The War Department, which is what the Pentagon was called back then, issued something called the Work or Fight Order. And it said that all men between the ages of 18 and 32 would either have to serve in the armed forces or work in an essential industry. Now, among those essential industries was farming, munitions plants, steel yards, steel mills, and shipyards. So slowly but surely, the Major League Baseball players who were subject to the draft realized that if they went to play on one of these baseball teams, they would be, in effect, working for an essential industry, even though they would be playing baseball. So there was a slow drift towards this direction in 1918. But then there was a famous player of his day called Shoeless Joe Jackson, who he was deferred from the draft because he had a dependent wife. His mother was dependent on him. He had 2 sisters dependent on him, and 3 of his brothers were already in the military. So inexplicably, his draft board rescinded his exemption and reclassified him as 1A. So Shoeless Joe went to work in the shipyard in Wilmington, Delaware. And the attitude became among the other baseball players who were nominally exempt. They said, well, if they can draft him, they can draft anybody. And so the movement started towards the Major League players moving into these Steel League teams.
Well, let's take a step back and just look at baseball within the context of American society at that time. Of course, baseball has for a long time been a really key sport for us. But talk about it back in those days, the early 20th century. How significant was it culturally?
It was the only game. Baseball was the only game. Collegiate football was just beginning. Basketball practically non-existent. What would have been called baseball, America's game. And every town, every company, every church, every school had a baseball team. Everybody had a baseball team. It was the sport, the only sport.
So you also talk about company teams, that industries would have their own teams.
Yeah. There were a lot of industrialized leagues, and they were quite significant. Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle both had fathers who played in the industrial leagues, and while they didn't play in the leagues, they grew up knowing about the leagues.
So as the United States enters World War I, certainly the war begins. Were the owners of the Major League Baseball teams, were they concerned that it would affect their season? Oh
yes, they initially tried to get baseball declared an essential industry for the entertainment and morale of the American populace, but they failed in that. So then they got the 1918 season extended through September. They cut about 30 games off of the schedule, and they actually played the World Series in September. But that's as far as they went. I mean, they started losing their players. Some players enlisted, and other players got drafted, and some players went to the Steel League.
Now, one of the terms that was common at the time was preparedness.
Yes.
What did that mean, and what impact did that have on baseball?
Well, the attitude, the very popular attitude was everyone should do one's bit, so to speak. And so that meant that everyone should participate in the war effort in some way or another, and anyone who didn't was, the proper term of the day was slacker. And that was a very negative term.
We'll talk more about the slacker, because we use that term today as well, but at the time it had a special meaning within the context of the war. You even talk about people who, if the term was used by a prosecutor in a court of law, it might be reason for them to get let off.
Yeah, the term was so negative that if you applied it to a criminal defendant, it would be grounds to bias the jury, so they declare a mistrial. There were slacker roundups. They actually had slacker roundups at baseball games where they'd go in and look for young men of the right age and see if they had signed up for the draft.
Now, co-owner of the Yankees, Cap Houston, early on suggested that teams institute military drills under Army NCOs. How did that work?
They did. They actually had the players would come out in their baseball uniforms, but they would have their bats shouldered like rifles, and they would go through different drills. They would march out to the flag and march back under the supervision of an army drill officer, and they would do present arms and shoulder arms with their bats.
So did this help them play baseball?
No, not at all.
Because there were some of the things you talk about in the book were, the owners of the baseball leagues were they were eager to have baseball seen as relevant to the war effort, and wanted to make baseball seem like it could help soldiers. And then the other side of it was, some of the militarization of the baseball game itself.
Yeah, they of course wanted to keep the game going because that's how they made their money, and as the season wore on and more guys were leaving for various reasons. The attendance dropped.
Now, as players were going off to war, how much did that deplete the rosters of these teams?
Different teams had different impacts. The Red Sox, the Boston Red Sox, who eventually won the World Series, had very little impact. Babe Ruth was with the Red Sox then. He played for the Red Sox. And, but they had enough of an impact to the point where the Red Sox needed outfielders. And so one of the most significant things about World War I was it was the beginning of the transition of Babe Ruth from a pitcher to an outfielder and a home run hitter. They knew from the times he came to bat when he pitched, there was no designated hitter back then. From the times Bruce came to bat when he pitched, they saw he could hit. So they figured, well, why not let him play every day? And so that's how he didn't make the full transition until 1919, but that was the beginning of it.
Now we talked about conscription and some of the baseball players being at risk. You mentioned Shoeless Joe Jackson. Talk a little bit about the power of draft boards. Clearly, in Jackson's case, they made a choice to reverse their previous decision. Well,
the local draft boards had absolute power, and they had they did not have to explain their decisions, and it varied widely from one board to another. Babe Ruth got deferred simply because he had a dependent wife. That was the only reason he got deferred, and other people had dependent children and did not get deferred. So there was no rhyme, no reason to it. But the one impact it had on Major League Baseball players was they weren't sure whether they could draft it or not.
So as the owners attempted to have their players exempted from the draft, how was that received by the public?
Not well. They applied the slacker label to anyone who didn't do their bit, and playing baseball was not doing your bit.
Now, baseball continued to play a part in the war effort itself. When the soldiers went overseas, the Army had baseball diamonds and baseball fields.
Yeah.
Talk about that exporting of baseball or taking it with them to Europe.
Well, they would send baseball equipment over to the training camps, and there were some really good teams connected to the training camps. There were some big players who went over there and played on these teams, although they also served. Grover Cleveland Alexander, Christy Mathewson, people like that played on the camp baseball teams, but they also served in dangerous duty.
Now, one of those was Cap Houston, who I mentioned earlier. He would also go into the Army. What was his role?
He was an engineer. He was a Army engineer.
And was he following the events that were taking place in the United States regarding baseball when he was overseas?
Yes, and he was very distressed by the fact that it appeared that baseball was not doing its bit, and therefore that's why he instituted the Army drills before the games, and they would have at the games they would have you could sign up. They would make an announcement. At the game, spectators could sign up, and they had enlistment booths right there at the games. Sign up before the first pitch.
Now, we talked about some of the different industries that were exempted, that were considered necessary for the war effort. How did they make that determination?
Well, obviously, munitions, steel mills, shipyards were essential, and so was farming because they needed food. So those are the main. Those are the four main exempt activities.
Now, with the war going on and everybody trying to do their part, was there concern that maybe playing baseball was frivolous?
Yes, there was that, but at the same time, there was people continued to go to the games.
And this even went up to President Wilson, who you talk about how he thought it was a nice diversion from the war.
Yeah. He did not want to end the season. He was in favor of continuing baseball and exempting the players.
How did the baseball owners try to change public perceptions of baseball within the context of the war?
There was talk of pitching grenades into enemy trenches and knocking heads with rifle butts and things like that. And I'm sorry, knocking heads with baseball bats and all kinds of kind of mixing the war terms with baseball terms. They even had a baseball hand grenade, which turned out to be not too effective and was never really used. But they did try to invent a hand grenade shaped like a baseball.
Now you say that baseball and the military became inextricably linked.
Yes.
How did that work?
Well, that way, they just made the connection between the troops. They made sure the troops knew what was going on in baseball. Babe Ruth was widely followed. He had just started to hit home runs, and so there was the famous Army newspaper, Stars and Stripes, carried games. Keep in mind, there was no way to know about a game unless you either went to the ballpark or you read about it in the newspaper. There's no radio, no TV. So as a result, the newspapers, including Stars and Stripes, carried detailed descriptions of the game, batter by batter, inning by inning.
Now, you talk about how at the beginning of the 1918 Major League Baseball season that the win the war hysteria had been injected into every aspect of life.
Yes.
What was that hysteria? Why was it whipping up at that point?
Well, there was great paranoia, for one thing. There were German U-boats were spotted in the Great Lakes, and there were spies German spies in cigar factories. It was considered unpatriotic to eat sauerkraut or schnitzel or drink schnapps. In fact, sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Slaw, and dachshunds, the dog dachshunds were renamed Liberty Hounds, just because of this anti-German sentiment.
Now, how much of this anti-German sentiment was whipped up by formal propaganda?
The government had a formidable propaganda operation. The newspapers participated, and so it was so bad that some of the stories were so preposterous. One story I remember was that the Germans in France were replacing church bells with hanging nuns from ropes, and after the war, all these stories turned out to be false. And so when World War II came along and the stories started about the Nazi extermination camps, a lot of people didn't believe them because of this previous experience with the false anti-German propaganda.
The decades leading up to World War I, the United States had seen a lot of German immigration.
Yes.
And so there were a lot of German-speaking Americans at that time, including Babe Ruth.
Yeah, yes. Babe Ruth actually did not suffer from the anti-German bias, probably because he wasn't known as George Herman Ruth. He was known as Babe Ruth, which kind of, the Babe kind of sanitized his name. But in fact, he spoke German, and his father had a bar in Baltimore, and they spoke German in the bar.
Now, you also mentioned that ethnic groups were pitted against each other and encouraged to buy more bonds to prove their patriotism.
Yes, yep.
Let's talk a little bit more about the Bethlehem Steel League. So did it start just as with players as workers?
Yes, workers, the best players among the workforce got to play on the team. They had tryouts, and the best players got to play. And it was very competitive. I mean, the owners of the individual mills and shipyards were very competitive.
And at what point, you talk about the changing in the draft status. Were these teams recruiting major league players?
Eventually, they did. Yeah. Once it got really competitive, the work or fight order went into effect on July 1st, 1918. And once that went into effect, then the teams knew they could recruit from. They would have a receptive audience to the recruiting efforts, and so they actually sent people in to the major leagues. A team would come into Philadelphia, and they would sit in a hotel and wait for them and try to sign them up right there.
How did the major league owners respond to these efforts at
They were
recruiting?
infuriated. I mean, they were actually taking money away from the owners.
In terms of pay, how did it compare with Major League Baseball pay?
Well, there are no firm records about how much these players were paid, but some of them made up to $500 a game, which is equivalent of $5,000 today. And the average worker in a steel mill made about $1,500 a year. So that's how that compares.
How did that play with the workers in the mills who saw these high?
It was mixed. There was great resentment about that, and it's in a couple of the shipyards, resentment broke out, and they went on strike to protest the preferential treatment given to the players. But there was also this kind of hero worship thing, where baseball players were, as they are now, kind of heroic figures, and so there were two conflicting things going on there.
So some of these teams, they start to almost seem like all-star teams.
Yes, they some of the teams were fielding 8 or 9 major league players at a time, and they were some of the games, some of the Bethlehem Steel games were outgrowing the major leagues. They would average about 3,000 to 5,000 people per game in the Bethlehem Steel League. And it was such, of course, they didn't have the ballparks to accommodate that. So fans would line the first baseline and the third baseline, and they had to put in a bunch of special ground rules because of if a ball was hit into the fans, was it a double or a triple, or they had different rules. But there was such an overflow of fans that was a problem.
When did they play the games?
When?
Yeah, when during the week?
The Bethlehem Steel League played on Saturday, and there was another affiliated league, not quite as big or anything, but a shipyard league played on Sunday.
Now, playing on Sunday often ran afoul of certain blue laws. What were blue laws, and why was that an issue?
Well, the blue laws are infamous, but they got away with it on terms that it was necessary patriotism, because the shipyard workers had to work during the week. They could only be off on Sunday. That's the only day they could play. Now,
in the book, you tell the story of several incidents where players and managers were arrested for playing on Sundays.
Yeah. They, particularly in Wilmington, Delaware. And there was a benefit game played in New York, and John McGraw, the famous manager of the Giants, was arrested, and I mean, he was released, but technically he was arrested for violating the no playing on Sunday rule.
So once major leaguers and some minor leaguers start making their way into the Bethlehem Steel League, were they long-term presences on these teams, or were they kind of coming and going?
No, they were on the teams. That was it. They did not go back to their major league teams.
And were these games being followed by the public with the same level of interest, say, as a Major League Baseball game was?
Not nationally, but certainly here in the East, I would say Middle Atlantic states. Certainly, that's where all the teams were, and I would say certainly, and that's where the population was too, and certainly it was followed with great interest.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
How much attention was being paid by sports writers?
Quite a bit. They would run the same idea. They would run a game story with a box score. The only thing they cut down on the coverage was war news was taking more and more room in the newspaper. They had so much room, and so that was cutting into the amount of baseball coverage. But basically, they were getting good publicity.
Now, when you researched this, were you able to find articles about these games?
Oh yeah, that's what I did. I basically I knew the days the games were played on, so I simply had to go to the newspaper the next day or maybe the following day, and read the accounts, which were extensive. I mean, as I said, they had long stories about the games because that's the only place you could find out about them, unless you went to the game.
Were soldiers overseas following?
Yes,
these
very
games?
much, very much. Yeah, they were much more interested in the major leagues, but they also, particularly the ones from the local area, central Pennsylvania.
Now, earlier you talked about Charles Schwab and his influence on creating this Bethlehem Steel League, but he would leave at some point and go to a government position.
He left before the 1980 season got started because Woodrow Wilson persuaded him to take charge of the nation's shipbuilding effort, and he did such a good job at that he emerged as kind of a national hero. Unfortunately, he ended up badly. He had a weakness for alcohol and women, and he died bankrupt in 1939. But he was fabulously wealthy at this point. When he left Bethlehem Steel to go to this shipyard job, he left the company. Bethlehem Steel CEO was Eugene Grace, who it turns out was also a baseball fan. He had played for Lehigh University, and in fact, he was so good that he was offered a contract by the Boston Braves. The Braves played in Boston back then, not Atlanta, and so he continued the interest in baseball, and he was very supportive of. In fact, he presented the championship trophy in 1980 to the Stilton team.
Now, at some point, these teams had professional scouts who were going as part of their recruiting effort.
Yes, yeah.
How did that work? Would they pick certain players that they wanted and target them?
They would look particularly for players who were in danger of being drafted. They could find out the draft status of what it was, and they would go after them. And players were feeling them out too. I mean, they didn't have to recruit that hard. I mean, because players were interested in knowing what the deal would be, how much money they would make, what they'd have to do. So it was a two-way street.
Now, there's also a Kennedy connection here as well.
Yes, the shipyard near Boston, Fore River. The manager of the plant was Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of the future president, and he was also dodging the elder Kennedy was also dodging a draft. That's several of his biographers admit that.
Yeah, but he would end up involved in the baseball team at the plant.
Yes, he did manage. Yes, he managed the team.
Was he a good manager?
No, it was the least successful of all the teams. Of the 6 teams that had the worst record.
So this was a 20-game season that they would play.
Yes.
How did they determine the champion? Was there a playoff series, or was it?
They had a playoff. The playoff was between Steelton and Lebanon. Steelton and Bethlehem. Lebanon had won the previous year, but the 2 top teams were Steelton and Bethlehem, and Steelton won. It was a 3-game series, and Steelton won the final game, and the key hit was delivered by Joe McCarthy, who went on to become a Hall of Fame manager with the Yankees. And he was not a particularly good player, but I mean, he was a good player, but he wasn't a Hall of Fame player. He was a Hall of Fame manager.
One of the players that they tried to recruit was Ty Cobb, but
yes,
he didn't want to have anything to do with that.
Cobb said absolutely not, and he said that, and he had no respect for the players that did do that. He went over. He was draft exempt. He had a wife and 3 children, and he could have. But he volunteered for the Army Chemical Warfare Division, which was the most dangerous service in the Army, and he did that. And 2 of the people who went with him were Christy Mathewson. Mathewson suffered a gas attack, And it ruined his career. It ended his career. This unit that Cobb was in was intended to repel poisonous gas attacks. And the other person in that, with Cobb and Matheson, was Branch Rickey, who was then a young executive with the St. Louis Cardinals, but of course he went on to become the Brooklyn Dodger executive who recruited Jackie Robinson into Major League Baseball.
So when these professional players joined the Steel teams, were they expected to actually do any work in the plants, or was it just understood that they were there to play baseball?
That's rough. Apparently, Shoeless Joe Jackson actually did work at the plant, but the people I talked to who saw Babe Ruth in Lebanon said he came to the steel mill in expensive clothing and hung around for a couple of hours, talked about baseball, and left. He never did any work. His official title was Blueprint Messenger, and no one's quite sure what that was.
Another player who played on the Steelton team was Eddie Plank. Who was he?
He was a Hall of Fame player. He was near retirement. He was very near retirement. He was from around here. I think he had a farm in Adams County, but he was a pitcher, Hall of Fame pitcher, great pitcher. He was one of the first people to go to the Steel League, but he didn't have to. He was over the draft age. He didn't have to worry about that.
Who was Al Schacht?
Al Schacht was known as the Clown Prince of Baseball. That was his later title. He was at the time of 1918. He was a pitcher. I think he went with Bethlehem. He was a major league pitcher. He went with Bethlehem, and he was a good pitcher. And he eventually went into the Army, but he did not go overseas. But he was not good enough as a player, so he took on this role as kind of doing funny acts at baseball games.
Did these teams hire experienced managers to run the teams?
No, the Lebanon team had a kind of a legendary figure named Pop Kelchner, and he was an interesting guy for many reasons. He was a scholar. He was a professor at Albright College. He spoke 6 or 7 languages, and he was, in later years, he became one of the greatest scouts in Major League Baseball history. He really knew baseball talent, and he's single-handedly responsible for recruiting 86 major leaguers, including Stan Musial. And so, but that was much later in his career. In 1918, he managed the Lebanon team. In fact, he recruited Babe Ruth.
For these Steel teams, did they were there eligibility rules, or could any Major League Baseball player just join the team?
That was a major issue in the Shipyard League. The rule was you were supposed to be working in the plant for 15 days before you could play baseball. And Shoeless Joe Jackson did adhere to that rule. But some of his teammates from the Chicago White Sox came to join him at the shipyard. And apparently, according to several descriptions, they showed up for the first game still carrying their suitcases from the train. They just had arrived on the scene and hadn't worked at all. So down the road, the league had an eligibility committee. And the best team in the Shipyard League was Chester. And they forced Chester to forfeit 4 games for having ineligible players. And so they never got the playoffs, and it elevated the Wilmington team to the top.
And you mentioned Chester is one of the best teams in the shipbuilding league.
Right.
So in the Bethlehem Steel League, over those 2 years, what were the top teams?
Well, the top 2 teams in 1918 were Steelton and Bethlehem. Lebanon was pretty good, and the other teams were not. The team near Baltimore didn't have a lot of major leaguers. For some reason, they weren't drawn to there. And the Fort River team near Boston, Joseph Kennedy's team, they didn't do very well. So the top teams were Bethlehem and Steelton. In fact, they played in the playoffs.
Talk about the umpires. Were these experienced umpires that?
No, they had a lot of problems with the umpires. There were a lot of disputes. There were actually some fist fights. At one point, there was a controversial call. I can't remember the team, but there was a controversial call that decided the game. And it turned out that the umpire who made the call was one of the players for the other team.
Now, one of the teams that you talk about is the Reading Steel casting team.
Yes.
That wasn't part of the league, though, right?
That was not part of the league. They were not owned by Bethlehem Steel, so they were not. But they did recruit a lot of players. In fact, at the end of after the Bethlehem Steel League ended their season, Reading Steel Casting fielded a team that had probably the three best players in the Steel League. Babe Ruth, Hornsby, Shoeless Joe Jackson, all played on the same team in the same game.
I would imagine that would have drawn quite a few fans.
It did. I think it was 18,000, something like that. Yeah.
So was a team like that? Were they just doing exhibition games?
Exhibition games, yes. At that game, they played the team from the Wilmington Shipyard.
Now, you talk about the importance of barnstorming during that period. You say most of the players, outside the regular season, would continue trying to make money. How did that work?
Well, they would play games. They would play exhibition games. They would go join a team join an existing team. As I said, there were teams all over the place, and so they would join an existing team for a fee. And of course, as a result, they would draw fans to the park, and that's how it. That's how they did it.
And so sometimes it was just for one game, right? They would come into town and get paid just for an appearance, and people would try their luck against a major league pitcher or a pitcher going up against a major league batter.
Yeah. And that was a very, very popular way to do it. Keep in mind that the average major league salary was about $4,000, which I'm sorry, about $4,000, which converts to about $80,000 right now. The current average salary is $5 million, so it's quite a. In fact, it's interesting how the game has changed in so many ways. Of course, there were no night games. Night games didn't come along until 1930 or so. Players didn't have numbers on their backs. Players didn't have names on their backs. That was new. The games lasted under 2 hours. Most games went under 2 hours, which is fortunate because they didn't play night games, and so they had to get the game in before dark. So the games only lasted less than 2 hours. Today, the average game, even with recent changes, goes a little under 3 hours, I think. So that was a big difference. So much more was expected of the starting pitcher. Walter Johnson, the great pitcher for the Washington Senators, in 1918, despite the shortened season, pitched 29 complete games. That's pretty amazing. And he 2 of those games were 18-inning games he pitched, and one of those games he pitched an 18-inning shutout. So that would never happen today, of course. In fact, you very seldom get a 9-inning complete game these days.
Now, you mentioned that the games had to be finished by dark. During World War I, daylight savings time was implemented. How did the baseball major league owners attempt to work with that?
Well, that was controversy because, all right, so the games, under standard time, the games started at 3. Now, when they went to daylight saving time, the games should still start at 3. But the owners wanted to start the games at 4. The reason being that the additional hour would enable more working men to get off and go to the game. And of course, in those days, the only way the owners made money was people paying to get into the ballpark.
Now, we talked a little bit about how sports writers covered this league and the major league players going to the league, but they came up with some colorful terms, paint putty leagues and the safe shelter leagues. The Steel League became the STAL League when they were recruiting players from the majors. I want to go back to the work or fight order that came down. So at early in the war, conscription had been going on. But at some point, they needed more people.
Well, they initially thought they were going to get a lot of volunteers, but they didn't get nearly enough. So they had to institute conscription, and they went round about how they going to do it. And finally, they decided that that they would have a universal draft, and the only exemption would be if he worked in an essential industry.
Now, for Babe Ruth, when he was playing in the Steel League, was he primarily a pitcher, or was he also an everyday player?
He only played one game. Babe Ruth only played one game. Now, he was on the payroll a lot, but he only played one game. And he played first base, and he struck out twice, and he was intentionally walked the third time. Now, keep in mind, though, what we have to keep in mind here is that no one knew the war was going to be over in 1918. In fact, the Major League Baseball had canceled its season, its 1919 season, fully expecting the war would be going on. And the end of the war coming in November 1918 was somewhat of a surprise.
Now, this was also a period with the influenza epidemic when it was going around, and we've gone through a pandemic. What was it like for them at that time?
Well, it didn't quite take hold in the U.S. until the fall. It did have a flare-up up in Boston. They think some sailors came in, and actually Babe Ruth got the Spanish flu, and he was given no one knew how to deal with it, and he was given a treatment that was actually counterproductive to curing him, and somehow he survived. I guess it's a testimony to his good physical condition.
So as the war comes to an end, how does that affect these Steel League and the Shipbuilding League?
Well, the war comes to an end. The draft is over. So no longer do these major leaguers want to play in steel mills. They want to go back to the major league teams, and of course they were welcomed back. There was considerable agitation in the press and among patriotic people to ban the players who jumped to the steel leagues from baseball forever. But the baseball owners had no intention of damaging their product that way. So when the 1919 season opened, everyone was back in the fold, and not only the players but the fans. Major league attendance doubled in 1919 over 1918.
So how were these leagues remembered? Did people just move on with their lives and kind of forget about them?
Yeah, not many people know about this. It's a very even around here, not many people knew. People were surprised that Babe Ruth played. The Lebanon Field was at 3rd and Green Street in Lebanon, and people are amazed to know that Babe Ruth actually played a baseball game there.
Are any of these fields preserved, or are any of them still?
They're all gone. They're all gone.
And is there? You mentioned the Lebanon County Historic Society. Is there an exhibit there that people can see?
They have Babe Ruth's uniform, and it's a gray uniform with red letters across the front, Beth Steel, and they have his employee card, and it says, among other things, it asks the question, use intoxicants? And Ruth's answer was no, which would have gotten laughter from anyone who knew him, because he was known not only as the Sultan of Swat, but the Sultan of Sat. He did a lot of drinking. They also have a very good photograph of the Lebanon team with Ruth on it, and that's on the cover of my book.
Now, you mentioned Babe Ruth's uniform. I would imagine that with all these stars there, somebody would have collected memorabilia. Are there any collections of memorabilia that you found?
That's the only thing I could find. I did find these two guys who were young men. They were actually teenagers when Ruth was here, and they remembered him playing. And that was the only thing. That's the only tangible information I could find out from someone who actually saw Ruth. There are all kinds of rumors about Ruth having illegitimate affairs and stuff like that, but there's no hard proof of any of that.
Now, you mentioned the newspapers and their coverage of these games, but did Bethlehem Steel keep any records?
No,
nothing.
Nowhere. The only records I could find were the newspaper articles.
What would you like people to take away from this book?
I would like a. I think one of the important things is it's a historical. It's a temper of the times, and how things have changed. How baseball has changed. How it's really no longer the American pastime. I would say professional football is the American pastime at this point, and I think I'm a baseball fan myself. It makes me very sad. I grew up in the New York City area in the 1950s, and there were three baseball teams there: the Yankees, the Dodgers, and the Giants, and they were all good. They were all very good teams. In fact, in my neighborhood and my friends, you were known by two things: your religion, you're Jewish, Catholic, or a Protestant, or you were a Dodger, Yankee, or a Giant. And everyone knew what everyone else was. And at this time, baseball was also, New York was also the epicenter of baseball. To give you an idea, between 1949 and 1956, that's 7 years, this is roughly my boyhood, there were 49 World Series games played, a total of 49 World Series games played. 45 of them were played in New York City. Only 4 games were played outside of New York City, of the 49. 2 in Philadelphia, 2 in Cleveland.
And when World War II comes around, was there anything equivalent to the Bethlehem Steel League?
No, there was really no way to avoid the draft. All the players went in. Ted Williams was a fighter pilot. Everyone, all the players went in that were of the right age.
So for the players who did play in the Bethlehem Steel League, was there any long-term reputation cost for them?
No, I don't think so. I think it was so short-lived that I don't think it ever had any effect. Now, of course, Shoeless Joe Jackson ran afoul of the world when he became involved in the famous Black Sox scandal of 1920, where the White Sox actually threw the World Series to make money from gamblers.
Well, we've been speaking about the book, Work, Fight, or Play Ball, How Bethlehem Steel Helped Baseball Stars Avoid World War I. William Ecenbarger, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Phil. I enjoyed it very much.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.